Hello to all those who sleep in this orchard wherein the snake doth sting. So today we will be looking at a Gnostic sect called the Naassenes, as it's rendered into Greek, coming from the Hebrew term Nachash, which in the book Bereshit, in the beginning, that is Genesis, uh, is used of the snake, of the serpent that deceived Adam and Eve. Hence why I opened with that quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet, which is said by the ghost of the father of the eponymous hero. And it obviously has resonances that harken back to the Garden of Eden and the deception of the serpent. It's a great play for those who are looking for a reason to restrain themselves from violating the Most High's canon against self-slaughter, as Hamlet himself puts it. At any rate, which is indeed relevant to the Gnostics, who, by virtue of their grim cosmology, you know, no doubt would have wrestled with such ideation. At any rate, so we're looking specifically at Hippolytus of Rome, St. Hippolytus of Rome's refutation of all heresies, which is a very thorough heresiological document that has recorded for us in great detail the nature of the cosmology and beliefs and scriptural exegesis of various Gnostic sects. Specifically, in this treatment, we'll be looking at the Naassenes, but also to some degree the Sethians, who seem to have been somewhat closely related in many ways, with a lot of overlap in their cosmology. And as has already been said, the grand thrust of the argument made by St. Hippolytus is that these Gnostics are greatly indebted to the Greek philosophical tradition, going back to the pre-Socratics, but also to the mystery cults, the various mystery cults of the Greco-Roman world, in really the broader Mediterranean, frankly, just polytheist slash pagan mystery cults generally. And my argument in giving these lectures is that this is a very neglected document, the Refutation of Heresies by St. Hippolytus. It's a source for so many pre-Socratic fragments. So when you get a critical edition of the pre-Socratic thinkers in Greek, so many of the aphorisms or short pithy sayings are extracted from this literature of St. Hippolytus without due attention being paid to the original context from which these fragments are sourced. So my argument is that if we properly engage with St. Hippolytus's thought and his document in its broader contours, what we'll actually get is an understanding of the pre-Socratics and the Greek mystery cults that is much deeper than what can be constructed if you simply isolate small fragmentary archaic quotations from the broader text, because the actual argument, the thrust of the general text taken on the whole, paints a much more detailed picture. And the bottom line is that the detailed character of the Gnostic cosmology will enable us to better understand the mystery cults and the philosophies of ancient polytheist Greece. That's the nature of my argument. If you don't like it, well, there's many other things you can do with the time you have on this planet rather than listen to me. So, you're welcome to leave if you don't like that. At any rate, so we're going to translate this opening passage. I've already done this in one of the prior videos on Gnosticism, but it doesn't harm us to hear it again because it's very much beneficial and frames the character of the information that is to come. So, this translating St. Hippolytus, and I'll be using my laser pointer to help those follow along with the Greek who can read Greek. So, this whole teaching of this discourse of the Gnostics, implied, is from the old or ancient theologians, namely Musaeus and Linus, who are disciples of Orpheus, right? Those who, in addition to Orpheus, who showed forth the mysteries and the teletai, right, the initiation rites. And they are concerning their womb, that is the logos, the discourse of Orpheus, and the omphalos, that is the navel, right? Remember, of course, the navel is the spot of the umbilicus, right? The cord that connected us as when we were all when each of us was a fetus to our mother to receive nutrients. And we should recall that places like Delphi, that were important cultic sites associated with like the reanimation of the dismembered Dionysus by Apollo, that was called like the navel of the world. Indeed, Delphi comes from a root for womb, which it gives us words like brother, adelphos, right, which is fellow wombling, as well as words like dolphin, right, delphis, because dolphins are mammals that grow in the womb, and so on. So the womb and the omphalos, the navel slash umbilicus, these are concepts that, according to St. Hippolytus, feature very prominently in the Orphic mysteries and by extension in Gnostic cosmology. That is a detail that you're just not going to get anywhere else that I'm aware of, other sources that focus on that. There is some stuff that suggests that the Pythagoreans, who are no doubt closely related to the Orphics, had like an embryological cosmology. There's some stuff on that, but even much of that stuff comes from Hippolytus anyway. So it's just an interesting little detail, and we're going to encounter many such things. Anyway, continuing with the translation. So from thence there is a certain harmonia, which literally means like an assembling of joints, right? Uh, and thus it is so in the Bacchica of Orpheus. And these things are performed like mystagogically as rites, and they are handed over to traditionally, you know, passed on to people by Kellius and Triptolemus. Now, those are two like chthonic figures associated with the Eleusinian mystery rites, uh, as well as uh, Demeter or Demeter and Kore, the maiden, that is Persephone, as well as Dionysus in the rite, the initiation rite, the Teleter, in Eleusis, as well as in Phlius in Attica. So pause there for a second. Highly significant because, as I will establish in another whole video in its own right, in my estimation, the Orphic mystery rites and the Eleusinian mystery rites are intensely interrelated, and Orpheus and Orphic materials kind of inserted themselves into that cult. And it would make total sense because a cult about the abduction of Persephone, and then you get a new avatar of Dionysus born of Persephone. Why wouldn't those two cults quickly become intermingled? I mean, intermingled, presuming that Orpheus is an intrusion anyway. I mean, that in itself, even though that is what the ancient sources suggest, is a bit of a presumption, right? I mean, who really knows how these things were initially established and revealed? I'm quite agnostic about the exact details. It kind of bothers me when people talk so staunchly with certainty about these matters, like as if they were there, as if they were the revelators themselves. Like, all right, buddy, sure. I'm happy to just be loose about these things. I'm just enjoying the process, right? As they say. All right. So before these mysteries of the Eleusinians, or these Eleusinian mysteries, uh, there was in Phlius the orgies, that is like the mystery rites, doesn't necessarily have sexual connotations, though as we've seen in other videos, right, there's plenty of genitalia being whirled around these contexts, so it's not totally unrelated. Uh, the mystery rites of the great goddess, right, the Megale Thea. Now, who is the Megale Thea? Gaia. It's our girl Gaia, isn't it? Uh, Mother Earth in this context. And that you can see why there'd be some crossover with Demeter slash Demeter, right? Because she's an agrarian goddess. She's associated with the earth giving up its fruit. So there's that happening, right? There's a bit of henotheism slash syncretism, whatever you want to call that, in your modern parlance, which is inherently anachronistic, right? Such as the nature of the matter. But this is where it gets interesting. This is where we get some cinnamon. So returning to the text, right? There is there, i.e., in this site of the Flying Mysteries, a pastas. What is a pastas? A bridal chamber. And upon this bridal chamber, it is written, until this very day, says St. Hippolytus, uh, the idea, that is the form which is quite an elevated Platonic word, right? Idea, the form of all the things that are spoken of all the logoi that are spoken of, all the discourses and tales that are spoken of. Because these mystery cults involved logoi, they involved tales being told, and then like rationalistic exegesis of said tales and discourse. Because, we in modernity don't, to the extent that you have any contact with religion, which, if you're a Westerner, you probably don't. And if you do, it's probably so stunted and anemic that it can hardly even warrant the descriptor religion, frankly. But, if you do have contact with such a thing, you won't have an environment where there's like rich discourse accompanying whatever, ritualistic practice you do, right? It's the notion of like exegetic discourse is not a living tradition in the modern world, I would say. You might be an unusual individual like me, a neurodivergent fellow, in which case you might, talk such things to your pot plants or whatever, but in all likelihood, you probably don't engage in that. Uh, at any rate, so returning to the text. So this again is a passage we've already had. So you can look to my other videos um, on Gnosticism for the details of my live translation of this passage. But the long and short of it is that St. Hippolytus tells us that he gets information from a now lost text from Empedocles, wherein we're told that the Sethian Gnostics borrowed their whole logos, their cosmological discourse, from this bridal chamber, this pastas in this on the site of the Flying Mysteries, and we're told that it showed a certain Phaios Ruetes, a light-emitting male divinity who's like an old man in a state of tumescence, right? Um, Subject to priapism, that is to say, with a pudendum in a state of erection, and he pursues a female who's dark or possibly dog-faced, who's called Ficola, whilst he's, seeking to be serviced, so to speak, with a bit of a non-consensual erotic liaison, as they say. And that's the nature of the scene that's displayed on this cultic site, this bridal chamber of initiation. And we're told about it that it was described by Empedocles, apparently. So that's quite interesting. And given that it's Empedocles and he's such an Orphico-Pythagorean fellow in my estimation, I think there's good reason to presume that this Phaios character and the Ficola character are probably Protagonist Phanes and Nuke/Knight, in my estimation. So I've spoken about that in another video. But now we're actually going to get into the real meat of the matter with the Naassenes. So I translate here from St. Hippolytus. And he says, there's a certain bunch of fellows who call themselves the Naassenes, which, as we said, are the serpentine folk, right? Because Nachash in Hebrew is the snake of the Garden of Eden, right? And they also call themselves, St. Hippolytus says, I'll better use my pointer, I forgot. And they also call themselves Gnostics, which means the ones who know, right? Gnosis is knowledge, so Gnostikoi are those who know. And by the way, as a pause there, I might as well say that the reason like patristic Orthodox thinkers are so aggro about these people calling themselves Gnostics is because they, the Orthodox, believe that gnosis, knowledge of God, theognosia, knowledge of God, is such an important and divine virtuous thing. They believe they are the custodians of that. And so when they see other people whom they consider to be erroneous and degenerate using that self-descriptor, it's offensive to them because they're like, no, you are not the gnostikoi, we are the gnostikoi. It's just something to be aware of. Like nowadays, Gnostic has all these kind of edgelord connotations and so on and so on. It's actually really just a descriptor that any like religion that sees itself as correct would want to use of itself. Like we have the correct understanding. We are the knowers. Ye are not the knowers, right? So it's an inherently like charged polemic self-descriptor that everyone was trying to use for themselves. It's just kind of stuck with these particular groups for whatever reason. Perhaps because they were so elitist. That's probably part of it, but whatever. Okay, so returning to the text. Um, so they dogmatize, or like they teach as dogmata, as teachings, as doctrines, these things which were formerly taught as teachings, as dogmata, by the philosophers of the Greeks, as well as by those who handed over the mystery rites. So that's quite an important point, right? That the Naascenes are indebted not only to former Greek pagan philosophy, but to the mystery rite initiators, that is, like Musaeus, Linus, and Orpheus, as were named earlier, and the kind of stuff that was happening in that bridal chamber, the pastas. Which, keep in mind, pastas, right? This bridal chamber, marriage, unlike today, where people might just shack up and copulate using contraceptives for extended periods of time and never have children. That was not a thing, obviously, in the ancient world. Marriage was inherently linked to fecundity, to children, to growth, to embryos, because whether you intended it or not, right, that's what would happen if you were, you know, gyrating. So that's just something to keep in mind, right? I mean, it should go without saying, but we live in a world now where that might not be obvious to people. This association of the sexual act with the growth of human beings, right? Obviously. All right, so returning to the text. So they from there got the impetuses, so to speak, for their uh, heresies, which keep in mind in antiquity, it didn't just stricto sensu mean a heresy as we mean today. It just meant like a school of thought, um, philosophically speaking. And they instituted their schools of thought, having taken their impetus from thence, right? Says St. Hippolytus. So there is a certain discourse among the Sethians whereby they are stealers of logoi, of discourses, um, from the uh, Hellenes. Now, keep in mind that Hellenes, but in Christian literature, has the particular connotation of like polytheists, right? From the wise men among the polytheist Hellenes, namely, and then he names expressly Musaeus, Linus, and Orpheus, and they kind of snatched up their dogma, their teaching. Okay, and thus was left behind for the like rebuking of these heresies to rush forth in such rebuking on account of the things that were formerly said by us when we put them forth, from which these heresiarchs get their impetus by means of like cobbling together things that were long ago stitched together, but towards their own specific like mindset, they put together as new these errors of the ancients, uh, so that they can deceive those who are capable of being deceived. And we shall show this in what follows. Okay, which is just his verbose way of saying, right, these dudes, these Gnostic opponents of ours, these Sethian Gnostics and these Naascenes, they just borrow all this stuff from the pagan mystery cults and philosophers who go back to Musaeus, Linus, and Orpheus. And we're going to show you how that's the case, that they're just copy pasters. They're not particularly novel. And, I already get, despite having already said this in past videos, there are people in the comment section who feel the need to say, like, oh, why do we need to dwell on this? Of course, it's very important to understand where St. Hippolytus is coming from, regardless of whether you like him or not, because that shapes the nature of the information we have. So that's his point. And it's really interesting because just as people, and presumably we all are interested in understanding, who the polytheist Greeks were and what their religion was, according to this description, they themselves saw themselves as their religio-philosophical tradition as having its roots in Orpheus. This is highly significant because if you look at, for instance, Diels and Kranz's uh, edition of the pre-Socratic philosophical fragments, the first thinker listed therein, from which we get fragments, is Orpheus. If you go up to people today and just ask them, like, with whom did the pre-Socratic tradition begin, they're going to say, like, Thales or something, right? They're not going to say Orpheus. But I would actually venture to say that we should trust the ancients on this and accept that they saw their pre-Socratic tradition as arising from the exegesis and ritual practices of the mystagogic cult established by Orpheus and his disciples, Linus and Musaeus. That gives us a radically different understanding because rather than the pre-Socratics being mere scientists, instead we get this idea that they are, religio-mystagogic thinkers that are in the cultic continuum of Orpheus. It's a very different understanding of who these people are, as opposed to making them generic scientists who are like counter-religious rationalists, whatever that even means, right? So anachronistic and so barbarous a reading of history, really. All right, so returning to the text now. So henceforth, uh, in the time that remains, we are called forth uh, to advance in this discourse concerning these things that have been laid out, so that we might start from those who dare to become the cause of deception by praising the serpent through certain novel discoveries, like certain inventions, according to like the energy, the activity of his logoi. Now, presumably, what St. Hippolytus means there is that these Naassenes are influenced by the capital S serpent in coming up with their discourses. Keep in mind, obviously, that from the Orthodox Christian perspective, right, the pagan mysteries, and then even more so the Gnostic cults that take the pagan mysteries and apply them to Christianity, are inspired by the serpent, right? That is by the devil. Okay, that's their perspective. Okay. Now, the priests and the like protectors or advancers, promulgators of this doctrine, of this teaching, this dogma, they were the first ones to call themselves the Naassenes, which in the Hebrew tongue or language uh, is so called because Naas, that is Nachash, is what the serpent is called. And after these things, they called themselves Gnostikoi, the knowledgeable ones, saying that they alone knew the great depths. Okay, and from these things, many were compartmentalized, right? Many broke apart into separate sects. Yep, many sects, many schisms, and they created like a heresy, like a group, philosophical group, one specific one, and they then would narrate through various teachings, various dogmata, and so came forth this logos. So these characters, um, according to their discourse uh, about all these things, they honor a certain anthropos, a certain man who's called the Son of Man, and this man is Arsenothelus, right? He is male, female, right? So he's a hermaphrodite, and he's called Adamas by them. And there are certain hymns, many hymns and various hymns that have arisen that are directed at him. And these hymns, to say a little about them, are sung by them in this way. And then this is now presumably a direct quotation from one such hymn. From you, Father, and on account of you, Mother, the two immortal names, the parents of the ions, and remember, ions are actual beings like principalities in Gnostic cosmology. Uh, Citizen of heaven, Polita Uranu, and great named Anthropos, great named man. And they divide him, like in the manner of Geryones, into three sectors. Now, if you don't know who Geryones is, that's the like gigantic three-torsoed, three-headed giant character whom Heracles engages in Greek mythology. So by saying that, what they're suggesting is that what St. Hippolytus is suggesting is that these Naassene Gnostics were particularly committed to a conception of the Godhead as the great hermaphroditic man, Adamas, and that he was conceived of as some kind of like tripartite being. So then it is said of this tripartite Geryones like Adamas hermaphrodite that he is such, namely that he has three components: the noeric component, the psychic component, and the choic component. Now, what does that mean? So, noeric pertaining to the nous, the psychic pertaining to the psyche, the psyche, right, the soul, and The choic component pertains to the earthen nature of the body. Okay, so he's noetic, he's psychic, and he's earthen. That's the threefold division of the primordial hermaphroditic Adamus man, who is the godhead of these Naassene Gnostics. So, translating the text, okay, so they think that uh, his knowledge of him rather, of Adamus, is the beginning of being able to know God. And they say thus, he is the beginning of perfection. He is the beginning of the knowledge of perfection, or rather the beginning and knowledge of perfection of this man is knowledge of God, which is like the dependent perfection. And all these things, they say, the noeric, the psychic, and the choic, right, the earthen, were uh, separated and came down into the one man altogether, namely Jesus, the one born of Mary. And they say that altogether, according to this one, these are three men who each get their respective essences from thence. So the point is that there are like three kinds of humanities, right? There's a choic earthen humanity, there's a psychic soul-based humanity, and there's a noeric nous-based humanity. And that all three of these divisions come from the hermaphroditic Adamas, who's identified with the Jesus who came down to be born of Mary. Okay, so this is what's the pausing the translation there for a second. This is what the Orthodox take issue with in the Gnostic Christology and anthropology, is that they don't like the idea that there are people who by birth are like assigned to different categories. Like there are the spiritually illumined people, the Noeric, nous-based intellectuals who truly know God. Then there are psychic people who kind of have a fair amount of capacity but are lower down, but they're still somewhat spiritual. And then there's like the absolutely base earthen people who have like no prospects of salvation. But this idea soteriologically of like some people are just, mate, you haven't got it. You haven't got that spark, tough titties, mate. That conception is an affront to the Orthodox who hold a soteriology that like no one by virtue of their birth is inherently like less spiritually capable of knowing God. You don't have to be a genius to be saved. It's open to all. It's just an interesting notion of why some would consider Gnosticism to be unappealing. It's that elitism and this fatalism of like certain people of a certain ilk by birth, and are just inherently cut off. It's a bit like maybe some conceptions of the caste system in Hinduism and so on, though not entirely equivalent, but somewhat like that. At any rate, returning back to the text. So these three genera or races or kinds of all beings, that's how it's divided according to them, namely the angelic, the psychic, and the choic. And pausing the translation there, notice that angelic is given as like a synonym of noeric, and that's not at all unreasonable because anyone familiar with the language of Christianity will know that angels are often referred to as noeric or noetic, like principalities, as noes, as nooses, so to speak, because that's what they are, right? They're hypercelestial intelligences, minds. Okay. They're not just conceived of as like winged human beings. That is an iconographic tradition, and it's presumably based on how they, can manifest, but it's not their truest nature. Their truest nature is, these hyper celestial intelligences. And if you want to know about that, you can read like Saint Dionysius the Areopagite on the angelic hierarchies, and that's a good intro to that way of thinking. So, furthermore, we're told by Hippolytus, returning to the text, that there are the Naassene's conception, there are three churches or congregations, ecclesiae, namely the angelic one, the psychic one, and the choic one. So, in other words, this tripartite division includes all the types of humanities and the types of churches and so on, according to the Naassenes. And the names unto these churches, respectively, these threefold division, is the elect, the called, and the enslaved or hostage. So obviously the Noeric people are the elect, the psychic are the called ones, the ones who have some potential, right? They're called, they're not totally cut off. And then there's the real losers, right? The prisoners, the captives who have no prospect of salvation, the bodily earthen fellows. Okay. And these things are the kephalaia, right? The chapters or the like the synopses, the overall essence of all of their things, of all their discourses. For they say that these things were given to them by Mariamne and Jacob, James, the brother of the Lord. So that being, those, for instance, pausing the text there, those who know, like, let's say, the infancy gospel, the proto-evangelium of James, I should say, will know that, like, Jacob slash James is the step brother of Christ in the Orthodox understanding. He's Joseph's kid from a former marriage, because Joseph is traditionally conceived of as a widower when he becomes the custodian of Mary. Of course, in Orthodox language, he's never called her husband, right? Because husband has the connotation of coition, right? You become someone's husband when you become one flesh with them. Joseph, in the understanding of the Orthodox, anyway, obviously did not do that, and you can see early writers like Saint Irenaeus and so on who clearly subscribed to the idea of the perpetual virginity of Mary as part of the Orthodox understanding. So, as such, the actual terminology used for him, for Joseph, instead of husband, is mnestor, which means like betrothed sponsor or something like that, which is a different relationship to husband, which has the sexual connotation. Because, in the Evangelium of James, he's quite clearly like an old man who's just appointed as like a guardian and carer of this very young maiden. And part of that narrative is it's emphatically stated that, he is not to have relations with her. And when he's accused of having such relations, it's like a huge scandal because that was never part of the arrangement, right? So that's a good text to look at if you want to just learn about like what the ancient Orthodox Christians thought of Mary and Joseph's relation to each other. Um, at any rate, returning to the text. So, but yeah, the point is, I should say before we return that St. Hippolytus is telling us that these Naassenes made the assertion that their doctrines were from a certain Mariamne and from James, the brother of stepbrother of Christ. Okay, so carrying on, that's their assertion. Now, in translating now, St. Hippolytus says, however, they are neither from Mariamne, like their teachings, and these unholy people, these disrespectful, unholy people, are lying, and nor is their stuff from Jacob or James, nor is it from his Savior, that is Christ. And we shall come to the teletai, the initiation rituals, from whence comes their myth. For it would seem that this is so among the teletai, the initiation rites of the barbarians and of the Greeks, and we shall see that the hidden things and the secrets of all these people have been altogether gathered by these fellows, the Naassenes, who lie by using the mysteries of the Gentiles, of the nations, and they lie against Christ and they deceive those who do not know these things, namely the like orgiastic initiation rituals of the nations. So pausing translation, again, this is this point that we've harped on about a lot already, that the whole thrust of St. Hippolytus' argument is like these people being duped by these Gnostic forgers, these deceivers who claim to be receiving, genuine apostolic doctrine from Christ and from his brother and from Mariamne. In actuality, they're just recycling material from the Greek pagan mystery cults and it would seem that a lot of the people being duped by Gnosticism and espousing it, according to St. Hippolytus, are people who are not initiated into the pagan mystery rites and don't realize that this stuff is not original revelation that these Gnostics are spinning, but is just copy pasted material from the Greek mystery rites, which, regardless of your opinion on religion, is pretty interesting because if we take that claim seriously, what that means is that the stuff in these Gnostic content, in what St. Hippolytus is going to tell us about Gnosticism, is going to help us understand what was said in the mystery cults, and we have very little other information. This is one of the rare opportunities to get detailed exegesis and cosmology about the mystery cults in the form of what the Naassenes believed, and the Naassenes being people deeply indebted to the pagan mysteries. Okay, so back to the text. So this hypothesis under them concerns Adamas, the anthropos, the man, whom they say, and they say that it was written about him, that, and now this is a scriptural quote from the Old Testament, the Greek Old Testament, his generation, who can narrate it, who can tell of it? The end quotation. So now it's a second person plural address. Learn then how, according to each part from the Gentiles, from the nations, this like inconceivable nature of the man, of the anthropos, and his generation, they take and they like deceptively, plastically apply it to Christ. So in commenting on how this like psalmic quotation about the generation of the Logos in the Old Testament being like called inconceivable, St. Hippolytus claims that these Naassenes take this quote that's about the Logos, the begotten God whose pre-eternal, non-chronological begetting cannot be conceived, according to this quote. He's like, St. Hippolytus argues that that conception is being inappropriately applied to this paganistic hermaphroditic Adamas instead of, the true Christ of the Orthodox, because they, of course, would take that psalmic line as referring to their Christ, to their conception of the Logos, as opposed to this Adamas, who's hermaphroditic, whom St. Hippolytus claims is just the god of the pagan mystery rites of Orpheus, presumably Protogonus Phanes. Now, of course, like being objective, there are very clear like typological similarities between the Orthodox Christ and Protogonus Phanes, but obviously narratologically and cultically, there are some pretty significant differences. The bridal chamber of the Orthodox initiation rite of baptism and communion does not involve, the kind of sexual assault that we see in the bridal chamber of the Flying Mysteries, for instance, as one of the many examples of differences, even though there are many examples of typological similarities as well. Personally, I would say the Orthodox mystery rites are somewhat more palatable in lacking that element of an old man raping a maiden, but some people might like that. I don't know. Some people might want to venerate such a religion. It's their prerogative, I suppose. All right, so returning to the text. So they say, that is the Hellenes, right, the polytheist Greeks, that Earth, Gaia, gave forth, was the first to give forth anthropos, man, human, a beautiful human, and bringing this forth as a geras, as like a reward, as a trophy, in place of senseless, that is perceptionless plants and unreasoning alogoi beasts, aloga therea, right? Unreasoning beasts. And so instead, she, Gaia, Earth, wanted to become mother. I should use my pointer, sorry. Wanted to become mother of a calm animal that is loving of God. Okay, so pausing the translation there, what is being said is that according to the polytheist Greeks, says St. Hippolytus, that Gaia wanted to create the first human as a pious, God-loving creature with reasoning capacity to distinguish him from all the other things which she had birthed, namely like non-sense perceiving plants and irrational animals. So she made this rational, God-fearing animal. Right? That's the narrative that underpins like the chthonic or autochthonous narratives of the anthropogonic myths of the mystery cults of the polytheists, says St. Hippolytus. Okay, so returning to the text, they say that it is difficult to discover, uh, and whether it be the Alalcomenaeus among the Boeotians, uh, who above the lake of Cephistis uh, held like the first or arose like the first of the humans, or whether it be the Idaean Curetes, that is the Curetes of Mount Ida, um, a divine race, or whether it be the Phrygian Corybantes, whom the sun Helios first looked upon when they sprouted up as tree-born beings, dendrophues, right? Tree-born beings, or whether it be the Procyllenaean Pelasgus of Arcadia. Now, Procyllenaean means before the moon. So Pelasgos is the progenitor of the Pelasgians. No doubt you've probably heard of the Pelasgians. They are the like autochthonous proto-Greek population of the land that would become Greeks when the Indo-Europeans arrived there, right? So like they're the aboriginals, so to speak, of Greece, the Pelasgians, these mythic like autochthonous proto-humans of that land. Um, and they were conceived of as having arisen in Arcadia, Arcadia being like a super archaic region in the ancient Greek conception. And they were before the moon. These beings, these proto-humans, the Pelasgians, spawn of Pelasgus, were conceived of, he was conceived of, Pelasgus was conceived of as being existing before even the moon, right? And these other beings that are listed, right, the Curetes of Mount Ida, the Phrygian Corybantes, whom St. Hippolytus tells us were seen as plant-born beings by the sun, Helios. That's quite interesting. I'm not aware of another account that speaks of them as tree-born per se, but there is like a line in Homeric poetry that talks about man being born of stone and tree. So that presumably was a reference in that archaic bardic poetry to this kind of a myth. And it's just so, I find it so interesting the way we get our data, the way it's preserved, the fact that it's actually in a late, like it's in an AD period Christian heresiologist that we get such juicy details about Greek anthropogonic mystagogic myths, as opposed to, in the older poetry, which is far more cryptic because at that time these things were still cultic secrets. Whereas by the time of Christianity, these things were out of the bag. I just think that dynamic, I know I keep harping about it, but it's just so important because it's just not duly appreciated in modernity because people don't read the sort of stuff we're reading now. They just don't. Regardless of whether they're, uh, coming at it from the angle of Christianity or coming at it from the angle of classics, people just don't read this stuff. And it's really a shame. At any rate, returning to the text. So there was also a certain inhabitant of Raria, which is like the region of Eleusis, basically, called uh, Diaulos. And there you have it again, the mention of Eleusis. Or there was also a certain Aemnos who was who birthed a certain beautiful child called Cabaros, who is associated with the ineffable, like orgiastic initiation rites. Now, the Cabaroi were associated with it doesn't say so expressed in the text here, but they were associated with the mystery rites of Samothrace, which were conceived of as like pre-Greek and very archaic. If I recall correctly, I think anyone could be like initiated into those. You didn't have to be an ethnic Greek. And I think there's some ancient source that mentions like a bizarre language being used in those rites, like a non-Greek language, which is kind of fascinating. But you might need to fact check me on that. I can't remember where that's recorded, if it is. At any rate, but certainly this Cabaros, who's the progenitor of the Cabaroi, this kind of proto-human race associated with mystic cults of Samothrace, yeah, it's certainly set there in Samothrace. or perhaps the Phlegraean Alcyoneus, who's associated with Pallene, the plain, like the volcanic plain where the gigantomachy occurred. This most elderly or most ancient of the giants. And then there is the Libyans also speak of a firstborn, a protogonos, right? Notice the connection between protogonos phanes and just firstborn humanoids generally. I think that's somewhat important that these mystery cults are always associated with like the firstborn being. And remember that Old Testament quotation about who can speak of his generation when speaking of Adamas as the Godhead. There's this association, there's this close association between the firstborn God and the firstborn man. Okay, which is even present in like Orthodox Christianity with the the new Adam and the old Adam and this sort of conception. At any rate, back to the text. So he arose from the like foggy plains, and he took his beginning from the oak tree, the sweet oak tree of Zeus. Now acorns and oak trees have an association in Greek thought, or just, I don't know, ancient Mediterranean thought, with like the first race of men. They were like acorn eaters and associated with oak trees. But again, he's just like the aforementioned tree-born Phrygian Corybantes. It's also the case that the Libyan Iabas, whom you see depicted on the right there in a mosaic, or at least a version of him, he was born from Zeus's oak tree. And then the Nile of the Egyptians was said to like put forth or leave behind mud, which even to this day is life-giving, they say, for animals take on flesh through like the moist warmth that is given up by the Nile. Right, so that's pretty interesting, and you can think of like pausing the translation there. You can think of like the frogs in the plague of Egypt, like arising out of the river. Like there's this conception of the Nile as this miraculously begetting substance, right? Um, Pretty cool. Returning to the text, so the Assyrians, it is said among them that there was begotten a certain fish-eating Oannes, and the Chaldeans speak of their Adam. And this Adam, they say, was Anthropos, was like the first man, whom who earth alone gave up, and that he was like lying down breathless and motionless and unshaken, like a statue, an Andreas, being an icon, an image of him who is on high, who is above, namely the man Adamas who is sung of in the hymns of the Naassenes. For he was begotten by many dunames, by many like powers, about whom in part there is much discourse. So that this great anthropos, this great man, might be like contained perfectly or completely from above, from whom, as they say, every like race, every clan is named patria, like every paternally named clan uh, on earth receives its name, and also in heaven were composed. So it was given unto him, I translate, it was given unto him, um, the soul, so that through his soul, um, things might like suffer and be tortured, and that the plastically created beings uh, of this great and most beautiful and perfect human might be contained or suppressed as slaves. So pausing there for a second, like what does that mean? Obviously, my translation is very literal and as such is a bit clunky, but to explain what's being said there, what that means is that St. Hippolytus is telling us that the Nicene conception of Adamas is apparently taken from the Chaldean Adam, Now, who these Chaldeans are is unclear. Like, is this the kind of Chaldean that gives us the so-called Chaldean oracles that are a very like Platonizing slash Hermetic like text body of literature, that you may have heard of that's quoted by the Neoplatonists a lot. I mean, the degree to which that is actually connected to Chaldeans, I can't really comment on because I don't know enough about Near Eastern culture in that era, in the era of like late antiquity, to to know exactly what's going on there to comment on that. But to the degree that there are records of such things, and it gets complicated because there are whole bodies of literature of like Zoroastrian and Chaldean content that are in Greek and Latin, and it's not exactly clear like to what degree that stuff really represents Near Eastern belief, right? I mean, it's possible that it is bona fide belief that's been like translated a lot into Greek terminology and Greek thought. Um, but that's a very complex area. Like looking at the genuine Egyptian components in like the Hermetic corpus, let's say, or the genuinely Chaldean components in the Chaldean oracles. Modern scholarship is very dismissive of that idea. Like that, I don't think there's much effort to do that. And the people that are making that effort are generally marginalized. But I don't think it's as laughable and stupid as people presume it to be. I just think you got to know your Near Eastern content. And unfortunately, I don't personally. So I can't comment on that. But to get to the meaning of what is going on here, there's this alleged Adam among these apparent Chaldeans, whoever they are, and it's believed that there's like a lower Adam who's an icon of the Godhead, Adamas, the hypercosmic hermaphrodite above, and that this lower Adam, um, as his image, is like the means by which the soul of the upper Adamas is entrapped in the earthen suffering realm. And consequently, that is why the grand, like anima mundi, the grand overarching pan-cosmic soul that is associated with the logos Adamas, the hermaphrodite, that grand soul like suffers through all the other beings that are incarnations that come from thence. Because generally speaking, in like the Sethian and Naassene Gnostic cosmologies, it would appear that we humans have entrapped within us like the light essence of the soul of the grand Godhead, the grand Adamas Hermaphrodite, that's come down into the lower Adam, and we are indeed icons of the upper Adam, and that grand divine soul in us suffers through us, through our fallen nature that is like disparate in the multiplicity of the realm of begetting and is kind of cut off but yearning to return to that upper noetic original Adam. That's what's being said here about the beliefs of the Narsines. Okay? And so return to this last bit of text to translate. And thus they call him, that is the great and beautiful and most perfect man, is the Adamas, and the Adam, the lower Adam below, is like the icon thereof. Okay. Now, just to recap all that complex material that we just had about the mystery rites, which is kind of important. So we're told that there is this Son of Man, this Arsenophilus, hermaphroditic Adamas, who's the grand noetic Godhead. We're told that there's a lower human that's a copy thereof. We're told that, according to the Greek pagans, Gaia slash Ger birthed man and wanted there to be a creature that is more theophiles, more God-loving than the brute, unreasoning animals and the senseless plants. And then we're given these instances of all like these proto-humans in the various like geographically localized mystic cults that pertain to earthborn proto-humans who are like semi-divine but also kind of the first human. Like that human divine gap is way narrower in the polytheist world than most people realize. It's very common in tribal anthropology for like the first ancestor man to also be like the son of God. I know that to be the case among the coastal indigenous people of the state of Australia wherein I live, as an example. Like this is an anthropological parallel, very, very common thing, really. At any rate, so you have these various examples. You have the Boeotian Alalcomeneus that we covered. We have Pelasgus, who's before the moon, Proserpinaos. in Arcadia. We have the Phrygian Corybantes, who were born of trees, right? Dendrophues, who are seen by Helios. We have Aemnos, who bore us Cabaros in the Samothracian mysteries. We have the Phlegraean Alcyones, this major giant in the Gigantomachy, who arose on the plain of Pallene, which is like the Phlegraean plains, which are very volcanic and are associated with where the Gigantomachy occurred and where they were kind of tartarized as punishment for their defeat in the war against the Olympian gods. We have a certain Diaulos, as Hippolytus calls him. This is likely the same character as Dusaules, who occurs in other writings, who's associated as the first man in Reria / Eleusis. Indeed, Pausanias also speaks of Eubuleus and Triptolemus being sons of this Dusaules, according to Orphic poetry, which is an interesting little detail that further substantiates the fact that the info we're getting here from St. Hippolytus is actually congruent with, what we have from our pagan sources. We're also told in Pausanias that Dusaules was the guy who established the Eleusinian mysteries. And then, of course, we've mentioned this Protagonos, this firstborn autochthon of the Libyans called Iarbas, and the fishman among the Assyrians. Just as a bit of extra info that's not actually in St. Hippolytus's refutation of all heresies, but we do know from Ephoros, who's a major early historiographer of the Greeks, that there were the dactyls, who are again beings who are often conflated with the Corybantes and the Curetes, who came from Phrygian Mount Ida to Europe, together with a certain Mygdon, who's presumably the progenitor of the Mygdonians, and Orpheus taught rites, we're told by Ephoros, in Samothrace. So even the Aemnos, who bore Cabarus, associated with the Orphic rites, associated with the Samothracian rites, my apologies, has an association with Orpheus. So it's just interesting that Orpheus and his poetry gets injected into the Eleusinian mysteries. He gets injected into the Samothracian mysteries of the Cabaroi. It just seems that Orphic poetry is really prominently positioned in all the sporadically dispersed geographic instantiations of Greek mystery religion. And it's a controversial view, but I would suggest that perhaps all this data enables us to conclude that even though there's obviously localized variation in Greek mystery cult, and it's kind of clumsy to speak of Greek mystery cult as a uniform thing when there's so much diversity, nonetheless, I would argue that if our sources are trustworthy, particularly in these late antique Christian heresiologists and apologists, it would seem that at least by the Hellenistic period and the Roman era, which may not be representative of the early tradition, though it may be, we don't know, it would seem that there's this Orphicization, let's say, of all the mystery cults, whereby the sparagmos of baby Dionysus, the hermaphroditic origin point of Protagoras Phanes, kind of gets injected into all of them, along with the abduction of Persephone and these kinds of dynamics of life and death and the changes of the seasons. And this marital genitalia component of the hermaphrodite splitting and rejoining in copulation. I don't think it's that unreasonable to say that that is a kind of typological profile of Greek mystery religion, and then it's all associated with fecundity of the earth and humans and this kind of embryology and growth and sex and genitalia and these sorts of themes. And it just makes sense that that would be a focal point of religion because, let's face it, in most people's lives, what are the two most intense things they do if they do them? Coition, copulation, right? And generating another human being. Maybe we are desensitized in modernity, but this is a very intense, and for lack of a better word, magical event. And of course, the other thing that is highly intense that not everyone does, but some do, is, slaying another person. And that's why often accounts of fratricide or murder or cannibalism are often thrown into the mix of these anthropogonic mystagogic cults as well, which makes total sense. You can see Clement of Alexandria in his account that I've spoken of in another video where he goes through that long account of various pagan mystery rites. He speaks of fratricide as another element in these mystery cults of Samothrace with the Cabaroi and so on. and the Corybantes and these sorts of things. And it's kind of part of the Titanic myth of the dismemberment of Dionysus as well, because they're kind of divine kinspeople who slay another divinity. There's this element of fratricide that's also very prominent in Empedoclean cosmology, right? The cosmology of Empedocles, which I intend to do a video on, which I suggest is also part of this same complex of Greek mystery religion content as well. Yeah, and on the point of those two intense deeds, right, of slaying and birthing, I can't help but think of this oddity in modernity where we speak of body count, right? Because there are two applications uh, of this term, namely that it refers to copulating with people or killing people, and whenever I get asked about body count, I always say, well, there's those two meanings, and for me, one of them is one and the other one is zero, and I'll leave it to your imagination to work out which one's which, given that I don't particularly like copulating. At any rate, so returning to the text, so it's we'll translate now. So they, that is presumably the Naascenes, they seek or actually perhaps no, I stand corrected. It's the pagan mystagogues, but by extension also the Naascenes, right? Because they get their content from there and they're kind of the same as them according to St Hippolytus. So they seek yet again to establish what is the soul and from whence does it come and what type is its nature, or how is it with respect to its nature, that she comes into man, into anthropos, and she moves him and she like enslaves him, dominates him, and tortures this plasma, this, plastically created being of the perfect man. Right? You can say this icon of the perfect man, right? Because there's this idea that the lower atom of Earth is an image of the higher Adamus, the noetic Adamus, and as such, like we are the plasma, we are like the earthen molded pot, so to speak, that images the upper divinity. That's the kind of idea there. Which, I mean, isn't that specific dynamic of like imaging and being like the earthen version of like the noetic archetype is not at all different from like the Orthodox understanding of the imago Dei, right? It's just where it differs is that these Gnostics believe that there's like this part of the divine essence that's entrapped in us. That's not quite how the Orthodox see it per se. Okay. Anyway, returning to the text. So they seek this thing, and it's not from the scriptures. They seek it not from the Christian scriptures, but rather from these mystics, right? The pagan mystagogues of the mystery cults. For they say that the soul is totally hard to discover and explain, and yeah, is inconceivable. Like can't properly be understood, like ineffably complex. And they say that the soul does not remain like in the same shape or format, but rather, and nor does she like always suffer like one passion, right, one suffering, but rather they claim that they say that she is like taken up in a particular tupos or typos, like a particular mold or a particular essence, and is kind of received therein. And these perpetual changes, diverse changes, are described in the writings that are the gospel according to the Egyptians. There they are like laid out. So yes, there is indeed a text mentioned elsewhere in other patristic writers, a Gnostic text called the Gospel according to the Egyptians. We have a few fragments of it, I think preserved in Clement of Alexandria, perhaps in Istramata, something like that. So that is a thing. And I think there's a surviving like Nag Hammadi text that is perhaps identified as this document or a related document that bears a similar title. At any rate, returning to the text, so they wonder or are at a loss, aporusin, um, just as all the other people from among the nations, the Gentiles, from whence and when the soul came forth out of what, right? Um, or whether uh, it is from like the self-born, or whether it is from some mixed up chaos. So pausing there, like what is being said there is, yeah, the pagan mystery thinkers and philosophers, presumably, like for them it was a bit of an open-ended question, according to St. Hippolytus, from whence the soul of man comes. Like, is it the self-born divine? Like you can think of the Hindu conception of like Atman is Brahman and so on. Uh, you can think of also this conception that it arose from like a mixed up chaos. You can recall like in Plato's Timaeus where the earth, well not the earth rather, the cosmos is moving about as like this disordered soup, and the demiurge comes and he uses maths and music to impose order and like creates the anima mundi, the world soul. But this idea of like the created soul is odd because it's like, whoa, in Platonic thought though, the in other texts, the soul is like eternal and ungenerated. So how does that make sense? I mean, that's a whole complexity. And I mean, Saint Hippolytus might have a point in suggesting that like these fellas themselves in antiquity were a little bit confused about it. But of course, that's not a totally bona fide way of putting it because even though it seems very complex and conflicted, they did have very nuanced understanding. Like Plato himself isn't necessarily just because just because his Timaeus gives an account of how the world soul is structured and is kind of generated, doesn't mean that he didn't also hold his perspective on, the soul being ungenerated, immortal, and so on. It's just, I guess, there was a conception of both generated and ungenerated faculties and forms of soul. And you have indeed in Platonism the mortal soul and the immortal soul, in the Republic and also in the Timaeus itself. So it's a lot more complicated than it may seem at face value if you're not an attentive reader. But at any rate, this idea that it's either like an Atman is Brahman situation. It's like this divine soul of man that comes from the auto-generated divine principle, or even the unbegotten divine principle, or this conception that like the human soul just arose from like the primordial muck at the beginning of time is another conception. In among other groups, there is like diversity of opinion, right? Is the point. At any rate, returning to the text. So, and first they seek refuge among the teletai, the initiation rites of the Assyrians, whoever they might be, like in this context. Um, and they come to understand the threefold division of man. For the Syrians first were the ones to consider the soul to be tripartite, but also be one. They say that the whole nature of the soul uh, like has lusts or hungers in this way and that way. For the soul of all things that are generated is the cause. And all things that are nourished, they say, and that grow need soul, are dependent on soul. For nothing, uh, they say, can acquire nutrition and growth, can acquire epiteuchein, without soul being present. For rocks, they say, are ensouled, for they have capacity for growth. For growth would not happen without nutrients. And thus, according to increase, the things that increase. That's a bit redundant, but hopefully you get the point. So for like adding or increase to occur, uh, food is needed for the thing that is nourished. For every nature of the things that are under heaven, or in the heavens rather, and that are upon earth and under earth, chthonic, they all desire soul. They all like partake of soul. And the Assyrians call this thing that's presumably the soul that like is dispersed through all things, Adonis or Endymion. And when he's called Adonis, they say Aphrodite yearns for soul, the soul that is associated with this name. So, in other words, you see on the right a like Pompeii fresco of Adonis and Aphrodite, and the point that's being made here is that, according to St Hippolytus, in the Assyrian mysteries, whoever these Assyrians are, right? But by extension, in all the pagan mysteries, is what's kind of being suggested, is there's this apparent dynamic whereby the soul, the divine soul, like the divine logos that's dispersed throughout all beings that suffer in this terrestrial world, all beings, whether they be celestial, terrestrial, or chthonic, underworld beings, they all partake of the same soul substance. And this soul substance is associated with the dying and rising Adonis, who is, as this grand soul, is loved by Aphrodite. Okay. And who is Aphrodite in this mystagogic conception? Well, St. Hippolytus tells us, returning to the text. So, Aphrodite, according to them, is Genesis, is generation, capital G, divine generation. So, generation, Genesis, longs for soul, who is Adonis. All right. So, generation, the relationship between all things growing and being begotten, which need nourishment, which is dependent on soul, capital S, that is conceived of as the erotic relationship between Aphrodite and the dying and rising Adonis. It's worth keeping in mind that according to St. Jerome's epistles, St. Jerome being a major, Orthodox church father of the Latin-speaking, Christian world, he tells us in one of his epistles that the nativity cave of Jesus Christ, because in the Orthodox iconographic and religious tradition, the stables wherein Christ was placed in the manger was in a cave, right? We're told by St. Jerome that that cave was apparently a cultic center of Adonis. I'll no doubt do a video of that in its own right, because I think that's just like, wow, that's very cool. And that's super, super interesting, right? That in the mysteries of these alleged Assyrians, and by extension, apparently of other polytheist mystery cults, perhaps, there was this conception of the like the anima mundi, the logos soul, as being associated with the dying and rising Adonis, who was yearned for by Aphrodite, who was conceived of as generation, capital G. That conception of Aphrodite as like a cosmic demiurgic force of generation is already present in people like Empedocles in the classical period, incidentally. So it's not like a necessarily a super late accretion per se, though it could be. I mean, who knows? But that's just a really nifty parallel. The fact that this dying and rising God that has all these logos connotations, apparently in these apparent Assyrian mysteries, that that the cave wherein Christ was begotten and placed in the manger was associated with that dying and rising divinity before Christ. And of course, from the Orthodox perspective, Saint Jerome, the idea is that the old demonic God is eclipsed in his little home cave by the true logos, who's born, at the time of the solstice, when we're most in need of the enlightening from above, and so on, right? In the Christian conception, of course, if you like are a pagan, I guess you'll just be like salty about that or something. All right, unlucky. Um, all right, so returning to the text, when Persephone and also called Kore, right, the maiden, capital M, uh, loved or erotically yearned for Adonis, they say that this is the like mortal component, a certain mortal component of Aphrodite being separated from Genesis, which is soul. Okay, so pausing there. So obviously, in the traditional like Greek myth that Aphrodite and Persephone kind of compete for the erotic attention of Adonis, whom they both desire, because he's just, as you can see there, I mean, he's just such a handsome guy. Um, so their contestation over their, shared lover prize is conceived of as like this fragmentary division between Genesis and Psyche and soul, right? In this mystagogic interpretation. Okay. And so too Selene, that is Moon, Lady Moon, Luna, right? She came into a state of desire for Endymion, that is an eros for his form, for his appearance, and they say that this is the nature, the physis, the nature of the higher things requiring soul. So it's not, pause there, the translation. It's not entirely clear, but I'm going to engage in like a bit of guesswork as to what that means. I think what that means, what are the hypsilotera? What are these higher things? It must mean like celestial beings and maybe even like planetary and astral divinities in the Gnostic and pagan conception. They too like wanted ensoulment, and that is expressed by the way the moon divinity Selene longed for like a mortal lover Endymion in the famous myth that's subject to many paintings. Okay. Now, they say that the mother of the gods, it doesn't say expressly, but that is like Cybele slash, she's sometimes identified with Rhea in some, syncretist context, that this mother of the gods, Cybele, she chopped or castrated Attis, um, whom she like had as her Eromenos, her lover boy. And they say that this is the blessed nature uh, of the hypercosmic and eternal things above, um, wanting to call towards herself the male dunamis, the male power of the soul. So pause to explain that. So we've moved from the apparent Assyrian mysteries now, and this is what I mean by according to St. Hippolytus' understanding, you can like flit about between different cultures and localized cults because they share apparently this common dynamic. Now, whether this dynamic was an exclusively Greek thing and that the foreign cults in their importation to the Greco-Roman world were like implicitly Hellenized and fitted into the Greek model, or whether in their independent places they actually had these qualities is, purely speculative and subject to debate. My personal opinion, and it's just that, and you don't have to respect it. Indeed, I don't even respect myself, so why should you respect me? But I would just suggest, from what I've looked at in anthropology, that there's actually something real to this, that all the religions of the earth, or many of them, I guess I can't say all, do at their core have similar typological dynamics and fixations on the same sorts of things, slayings, dismemberments, copulation, and genitalia, fecundity, and these sorts of things. Like it's not that unreasonable, really, to just presume that there could be like a core essence to some degree across many cults, across many places. It's not, this was a pretty common way of seeing things in the pre-modern world. Of course, you have to be careful not to be like overly reductionist and messy and just say, oh, everything's the same and slop it all together. Of course, there's always nuances and distinctions, but in our obsession to taxonomize and distinguish everything, we shouldn't overlook strong like commonalities and typological, similarities. Anyway, so returning to the text, and they say that there is an anthropos, a man who is arsenothelus, is hermaphroditic, is male female. And according to this, logos, among them, it is very evil or wicked, and it is like it impedes, according to their teaching, the uh, homilia, the like uh, interfacing between of a woman towards that she shows towards a man, right? So what is being said there in plain English by St. Hippolytus? Basically, what he's saying, and I have to put on my shades for this one to mask my tears, is that this cult, right, the Gnostic cult, and presumably the mystagogic cults to which they are indebted, were like anti-natal, were like against sex, or viewed it as a problematic thing. Now, without going on like too much of a rant about that topic, there is a certain rationale to this. I mean, think about it. If you believe in a world wherein there is reincarnation, there are beautiful, ethereal, pure souls that have like a luminous, non-corporeal existence, and that when they get sucked into a body, they experience like pain and get like dissipated and lose their like pure noetic faculty as a result of being embodied. If you view incarnation as such a like terrible event, it makes total sense that you would then view sex as inherently problematic because sex makes babies, and what are babies? Well, they're like meat machines wherein souls suffer, and that's no bueno, right? So that's their conception, this kind of polytheist slash Gnostic conception. Now, of course, that's greatly reductionist and it's more nuanced than that. And indeed, many of them still like continued to have kids. You know, it's not like they all were so into this conception that they stopped copulating. But it does point out that there is this tension when you believe in such a cosmology of the soul being entrapped in a meat machine and this world being inherently like disparate and problematic and caught up in a multitude of suffering and being lower than an above world and quite ontologically separate therefrom. It creates a real tension that is hard to navigate and hard to make sense of. I can't personally, again, it's just my opinion, I can't personally understand why one would want to have want to create a child if you conceive of, you know, the human being as a soul fallen from above into a vile meat machine that needs to escape therefrom. It seems quite like redundant. There seems to be, in such a frame of mind, there seems to be a really strong incentive to live ascetically and to avoid copulation at all costs. And that is what St. Hippolytus is identifying here. And it kind of makes sense, like you see in the life story of Orpheus. He progresses from being a lover in the famous Eurydice story, or Agriope, depending on which tradition you go by, the Roman Latin writers or Apollodorus's Bibliotheca. At any rate, you know, there's the whole story about Orpheus, you know, and the love and going down to the other world and looking back and so on. He starts off as this, you know, romantic music dude with his chicky babe, and then he ends up what? Becoming a weird, like, abstinent fellow who engages in non-procreative sex with boys, and then is torn apart by jealous women that are infuriated by the fact that they're undersexed. So in that whole like mythic cycle of the life story of the dude who is associated with introducing all these mystery rites, you kind of get that tension playing out, don't you? Which is such a dominant tension. I mean, it's in Euripides's play, The Hippolytus. It's all over Greek literature, and not just Greek literature. I mean, you can find it in the literature of the Indian subcontinent. Just generally, I mean, it's not to make light of it. I'm not being like even though I might be like biased or polemical or whatever, I'm not making light of it. I mean, there is something to be said of this antinatalism. It's understandable that people experience that tension. It is kind of there, but I just don't know if these cosmologies provide the healthiest way of navigating that tension. All right. Anyway, that's just my rant. Take it or leave it. Returning to the text. Okay, so they say that Attis was chopped, got the snip, right? Got castrated, mutilated in the genitalia. And this, they say, is the involves parts of the coic or earthen parts of creation that are below, um, making like a transition towards the essence of the eternal essence that is above. For they say that there is neither female nor male, but rather a new creation and a new man who is hermaphroditic. So pause there. What's this talking about? So remember, Attis is like a um was conceived of as a hermaphroditic being originally, and so by his snipping is associated with the division that brings about like the male-female dichotomy. Okay, you can think of a myth that I will no doubt treat in its own right, namely Plato's Symposium, the myth told by Aristophanes concerning the sphere men who are conceived of as, at least some of them, the ones from the moon, are conceived of as male female creatures that are cut in half and that the two halves yearn to be re-yoked in coition, right? In what in olden times used to be called carnal congress, right? I quite like that idea. It's a good translation of the term used by St. Hippolytus for homilia, right? The homilia of the woman unto the man, right? Because in olden times, You know, coition was conceived of as a very intimate exchange between man and woman, as opposed to what it is for most people today, unfortunately. All right, so, but the point is that according to St. Hippolytus, there is at the crux of all these mystery rites, among which one of them is those of Attis. And I remember I've done a video extensively about Attis and pointing out how it's quite connected to the Orphico-Dionysian mysteries, because Dionysus too was associated with like a severed phallus, which is a similar dynamic to Attis, right? And there's the whole dying and rising and vegetative elements. There's that typological commonality to the point almost of identification, right? But the key thing is that in the eternal realm of the divine hermaphrodite, there is like no female male split, whereas it's here in the realm of multiplicity and degeneration, severed from the divine one, wherein you get that split. And as a side note, right, even in Orthodox Christian theology, there is the conception of like an Eden and an eschaton wherein there is no sex, right? I mean, famously, right, if you recall in the Gospel of Matthew, I believe it is, Christ, when he's disputing with the Sadducees say, like, well, if a woman has had like multiple husbands in series, uh, when they're resurrected, as you Pharisees believe, and we don't, when they're resurrected, with whom will she copulate? Who will be her spouse, given that she's had so many? Lol, checkmate. And Christ is said to reply, like, you fellas don't get it. Because you don't get that in the eschaton, in the end times, in the new creation, as is the phraseology used here by St. Hippolytus. In the new creation, there is no coition, right? There is even really no female male. Like you get in St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, where it's like there is no slave and free man and Scythian and Greek and woman and male in Christ, but rather there's like oneness in the divine. You could call him hermaphrodite in so much as he like incorporates all together, right? Lady Ecclesia, Lady Wisdom, and Christ the male Logos are, one, and the multiplicity is gathered up into a sexless one. So that is something shared typologically by the Orthodox and the Gnostics and the pagans and so on. Because, I mean, who would deny that anyway, right? Regardless of what your perspective is. I mean, that's to me such a true dynamic. All right. So they say that, yeah, there is this man, this anthropos, who is Arsenothelus, who's male, female. And they say that he is somewhere above and that he came according to his own, to show his own place, right? So the idea is like stuff got severed from on high and fell, and the primordial noble noetic hermaphrodite had to send some of his matter down to retrieve the stuff that broke off from him into multiplicity. This is something that you kind of see in the Timaeus, even though it's not expressly stated. It's kind of there in Plato's Timaeus, in the background, but not expressly stated. You see it in like the creation story of Buddhism as preserved in the Pali Canon, in the Aganya Sutta, which I will no doubt talk about one day, and so on. And it's a very interesting idea. And again, it's not super different from the Orthodox conception. That element of the bit being broken off and needing to be restored in some ways, typologically at least. At any rate, they say that there is testimony in their logos, in their discourse, not only about Rhea, remember who is identified with Cybele in this era, and probably a lot earlier, but rather, as the saying goes, with all of creation. So again, this idea of like the pure noetic um, principality that causes the castration also wants to gather up the multiplicity back into oneness, the division of the sexes back into the hermaphroditic monad, right? Quite a compelling dynamic. And that's, what coition is all about, right? I mean, when a male and a female get it on, the idea is that they are returning to their true, complete form, right? We use this language of the missing half to this day, right? My other half and so on. But people have kind of, now it's just a redundant saying. I don't think many people really conceive of their sexual partner as such. Okay. So this thing is said by them or through this logos, this discourse of theirs, as they like explain it, as they make it clear. The invisible things of his are from the building or the creation of the cosmos, and the noetic things are seen within the created things. For the eternal slash invisible, both of those conceptions are built into the word aidios, both invisible and eternal. Power, dunamis of his, of the Godhead presumably, and his divinity, his theotes, um, is such that they are without like legal defense, without justification. So pausing there for a second, what that means is like we're going to see in the passage from St. Paul's letter to the Romans that is actually quoted by St. Hippolytus extensively in the upcoming passage. What that means is the Gnostics and the Orthodox agree really on this point that there is in the visible world a means, and the Platonists obviously like first taught this too, uh, and no doubt probably the mystery cults before Plato, to whom he was probably indebted, that you can in the visible world perceive, right, the traces, faint traces of the forms or of the original like noetic archetypes above, right, is the kind of idea, all right, that's being conveyed here. All right. So since knowing God, they did not uh, like doxologize or praise God, nor like thank Him, but rather their senseless heart was taken up like by vanity. For um, according to this logos among them that is totally wicked, it impedes through teaching the homilia, right? The sexual congress of woman to that she showeth towards man, right? Which is the phrase we already had before. And now there's a repeat of the text about, Attis who was castrated. This is the lower parts, the coic, the earthen parts of creation, you know, um, trying to move back up towards the eternal essence above. For they say that there was in the noetic upper realm neither female nor male, but rather a new creation and a new man who is inherently hermaphroditic. Okay, so now we get this bolded passage about the nature of how these pagans and these Gnostics lack a legal defense, so to speak, lack a justification for their position because they should know better because you can perceive in the visible things like the noetic archetypes, and so they should have like come across the correct orthodox theology rather than their false ideas if they had been like proper students of what is observable, because a proper understanding of what is observable leads you to an understanding of what is invisible, if that makes sense, is the argument. All right, and then we get stuff that we've already translated. I think I accidentally double pasted some of the text here, which is why we get the repetition. But anyway, carrying on where we're supposed to be. So this is the quote now from Paul's letter to the Romans. So they say, or speaking as wise men, they nonetheless like were rendered moronic and stupid, for they changed the glory of the incorruptible God for likenesses of the icon, the likeness of the corruptible or decaying man, and of birds, and of four-legged creatures, and of crawling critters, reptiles. Okay. Now, what is St. Paul saying there? He's saying that the pagans, when they fell under the demonic conception of idolatry, they took the formless, true capital G God, who's above all generation. They took him and they rendered him in the likeness of corrupted man and birds and beasts. Now, the key thing of corrupted man, right, is remember that, like in the Orthodox Christian conception, the Imago Dei, right, Adam, as he was truly made originally before the fall, cloaked as he was in uncreated light, this radiant being who's so perfectly images God that, according to the Cave of Treasures, that amazing Syriac text, the angels like prostrate before him, which is something that crops up in the Quran as well, right? When their conception of Iblis or Shaitan refuses to bow to Adam, right? It was obviously a Christian midrash before, Judeo-Christian midrash before it got incorporated into the Islamic corpus. But um, at any rate, the point is that, yeah, we're not talking about that image of God, because the truth, if you saw the prelapsarian Adam in the Orthodox conception, Adam before the form, his imaging of God was so perfect that you would learn about God by looking at him, right? Which is why the angels, who hadn't seen God, because no one has truly seen God, not even angels, like the true transcendent Godhead is actually ineffable, invisible, inconceivable, right, in Orthodox understanding. He only becomes ascertainable through his image and likeness, whether that be the tabernacle, which is this perfect imago mundi, right? The tabernacle, the tent dictated to Moses in the book of Exodus is conceived of as like the blueprint of all reality that shows the anima mundi, the nature of God as he manifests in his creation, which is what this passage in Romans is all about, right? Y'all should have known about the true noetic Godhead through the created world, because you look at the created world and it's a blueprint of the creator's nature, right? Is the argument. Okay. But yeah, the claim is rather than any of that, what these, idolatrous people are doing who claim to be wise in instituting these polytheist religions is that they operating under a misapprehension took like the transcendent divine nature and applied it to fallen stuff, shadowy, distorted images of the true divine nature, and as such, like desecrated the divine essence in so doing, and made the category error of identifying the uncreated, luminous divine with the corrupted, fallen creation. That's the thrust of the argument. In case you already know that, you probably kind of did, but it kind of helps to hear it explained in a way that's a bit more, juicy than the typical decerebrate explanation that you'll encounter in the world. All right, so God gave them over to passions of like non-honorableness, right? Uh, disrespect, however you want to translate that. So the point is that, okay, God saw these people creating these cults that dishonored his nature by associating the transcendent divine with the fallen creation. And so as a result, as punishment, if you will, he led them to be handed over to their own like wild, impassioned desires that will disgrace them. That's a good translation for atimia, disgrace, something. It's actually a lot heavier than that, though. You know, disgrace in the sense of like when your dad says to you, you're a disgrace. Like, I don't know if you ever hear that. I know I often hear that. At any rate, so the females or their females changed the natural use for the unnatural use. Now, putting a pause there, like this is obviously this is talking about, to be frank, tribadism, as it used to be called, right? Lesbian activity, sexual activity, woman on woman situations. So the point in this passage of St. Paul is that dysfunction, as he conceives it, arose as a result of like the gross passions that arose in humanity after their creation of idols, which involved the distortion of the truly transcendent divine essence by identifying it with the corrupted fallen creation, right? Uncreated divine essence being wrongly identified with corrupt created fallen things, as opposed to rightly perceiving the prelapsarian creation as the image of God's true essence. Okay. So as a result of that category error, that philosophical category error that produced like false religion, right, in his conception, as a result of that, people became like lustful and engaged in these practices. And he specifically names women engaging in tribadism. Okay. And we have to understand, you hear this kind of language of unnatural quite often in these contexts. In modernity, I feel like unnatural has a weird connotation, and I don't know if people know what they're saying anymore when they say like that's unnatural. Like I mean, at a certain point, like in the modern sense of the word, everything we engage with is unnatural. Like all these a glass, whatever, all these constructed artifacts, the microphone, but then by the same token, also all this stuff comes from the natural world. So what is, I don't know what modern people mean when they say natural, but I do know what ancient people meant. Phusis in antiquity had to do with the root meaning of the verb phuor, to sprout, to grow. So phusis means begetting, right? All of nature can be called genesis or phusis because both of those words, genesis means begetting, generation. Phusis means sprouting or growing. And as we saw with all this talk of coition and nourishment and growing and embryos and blah, 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 and omphalloi, right, navels and umbilical cords and so on, it's all about growing, right? And things sprouting into being, organisms swelling and blooming and flourishing and engaging in fecundity, right? Right, growth and plentifulness and all these things. Okay, that's what phusis is. Nature produces seeds and animals, and they all grow and they all, copulate and spread and create a plethora of beings. Okay, but the point then of coition, of copulation in this understanding, which isn't just Orthodox Christianity, it's actually like quite common, across the board in the pre-modern world. The point of natural coition, uh, you know, sex that endorses phusis, growth and generation. The point of it is that offspring arise. So if you engage in a form of coition wherein you might ejaculate, you might experience an orgasm, but you don't get growth happening, you don't get babies arising, well, that is against phusis. So when the ancients say that's unnatural, that's non-natural, it's counter nature, what they mean is not some like appeal to like, oh, does this occur in nature? Like for instance, oh, you might say, oh, but look, there are, you know, animals engaging in homosexual activity. Therefore, it's natural because they're animals in the natural world and they're doing it. I don't think an ancient person would get that argument because they would go like, yeah, they're animals in the natural world doing it. That's a fact, but it doesn't produce growth. That's the issue we have with this. Not that it doesn't occur and it doesn't like arise in organisms. Yeah, of course it does. I mean, as the text says, God himself led them to have these passions, to be humiliated, to be dishonored. But the point is in this conception that it is against growth. That's what's wrong with it, is you're getting stimulated, but you're not contributing to growth. And growth in this Orthodox conception anyway is inherently good. Of course, in a polytheist or Gnostic conception, you can argue that growth is actually bad, right? If growth involves noetic, beautiful souls in the above realm falling down into this horrible realm of suffering, that's not good, right? In that conception. In fact, for that reason, you should either not ever engage in coition, or you should engage in a form of coition that enables you to get plenty of stimulation without having to worry about babies, right? And I mean, what better way to do that than be, homoerotic, right? That's just explaining the mechanics here. That should be obvious and self-explanatory, but due to various changes in language and conception of reality, and probably due to contraceptive technologies, people no longer think this way. And this is, of course, why like many, hardcore, Orthodox Christian thinkers are very, have a very negative opinion of the use of contraceptives, right? Because it's seen as stopping the growth and flourishing that is, supposed to be endorsed. And this goes to root conceptions of like, is being born good? Is creating children good or bad? From whence cometh the soul? How does it arise? Does it come from without, or does it arise simultaneously with the human organism? And so on and so on. There's all this philosophy and soteriology and meaning built into how we conceive of sex, which is why it's always been such a focal point for religions. Why wouldn't it be, right? It's such an important thing that we do. It's how we got here, right? Okay, but that's just had to be said because this idea of unnatural against nature, paraphysian, that conception has to be understood in terms of, does the coition produce offspring and growth or does it not? That is what determines. And at least in the Orthodox understanding, there's like a moral condemnation of non-productive coition versus productive coition. All right. Okay. So this natural physicae crucis, natural use, right? This begetting use, right? Because remember, natura in Latin, where we get nature, it actually had like a G in its super archaic form, such as like natura, genitura type situation. So when you put it like that, you can see how it's connected to Genesis and what I was talking about. But just as we've lost the G, we've also lost the conception of what natural meant in the ancient world, right? We lost more than just the G. All right, so yeah, this natural use, according to them, um, we shall speak of later. Similarly, the males left the natural use, the Fusican Kresin, of the woman and instead burnt up hotly in desire for each other. For males would work shamefulness in other males. So I don't think you need me to explain what that is talking about. And then in brackets, we have this shamelessness, this askemosune. Now, not only does it mean shamefulness, it also means like a lack of form. Because, in the ancient world, seemliness, moral and physical seemliness were quite closely related, right? There's this idea that not only is it bad morally, it's bad optics. And I don't know how much of that stuff you've seen, but maybe it is. I don't know. I guess it's a subjective viewpoint. At any rate, so this shamefulness slash unseemliness, ugliness, um, was first and blessed, according to them, the um, shapeless essence from which like all shapes get their shapeliness is the cause of all shapeliness. So that bracketed bit, by the way, so that's obviously not part of St. Paul's epistle. That's St. Hippolytus interjecting about how the Naassene Gnostics understand this passage of Paul. And he's claiming that the homosexual shamefulness, as St. Paul calls it in his letter to the Romans, that it was identified by these Naassene Gnostics as the blessed and shapeless essence. So we can think of like how Plato in the Phaedrus conceives of as the divine noetic essence as like shapeless, as formless, colorless, and so on. He's claiming St. Hippolytus is claiming that the Nazarenes identified homosexuality with that like original blessed divine essence, prelapsarian, pure essence of the one that is not associated with like the fallen, incarnated world. That's quite interesting. And it relates to this idea that the Gnostics see, growth and generation and copulation as inherently problematic. So it makes sense that they would idealize homosexuality because it's non-generative. That's the claim. Now, whether this is like slander against the Gnostics and they didn't actually idolize homosexuality, okay, I mean, you can debate that to the cows come home if you want to, but we do know from like the tale of Orpheus in Phanocles, the Hellenistic poet that I've done a video on this channel, we know that after Orpheus's failed attempt to save his lovely lady Eurydice slash Agriope from the underworld, he turned to pederasty, and that peeved off a lot of aggro women who killed him in Thrace, Bistonia. So I would venture to say that that concept of like the idolizing of non-productive homoeroticism over productive, in inverted commas, natural female male relations probably is built into the pagan mystery cult religion of Orpheus to some extent. To some extent, though it's nuanced and complicated because, of course, there is a bit of female male fecundity stuff happening in like Eleusis and many other places as well. And of course, it's not as if these ancient polytheist cultures were like totally homoerotic. They obviously still had plenty of, heteronormative coition occurring as well, but it's just part of the complex mix. But it is an interesting thing if we can trust Saint Hippolytus that the like undivided, pure, colorless, featureless, divine essence from which all has fallen into its multiplicity of shapefulness and from which it inherits its shape was associated apparently with this askemosune, this unseemly practice of homosexuality. I mean, what to make of that, I don't know, but that's what's there in the text. Anyway, and then we have the bolded part of the end of the Romans passage, and the like wage or the return for their deception they shall receive in these things. So presumably that's saying like, yeah, you do bad stuff, you're gonna cop it in your bad stuff. All right, so and in these logoi, in these discourses, which Paul said, they say that this is St. Hippolytus speaking now, that all of the hidden and ineffable mystery of blessed hedone, like joy of theirs, is contained. Okay, so pausing the text for a second, I should also go back and point that this non-bolded passage here, where St. Hippolytus says, and what this natural use according to them is, we shall speak about later. That's not from St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. Rather, that's St. Hippolytus injecting some commentary about the Naassenes, the Naassene Gnostics, and what they do with this passage by saying like they have a particular definition of the physicaire, the natural use of the body in sex, that we will talk about later. He's just injecting. So this he's saying, St. Paul is saying, this is the passage of St. Paul that these Gnostics misinterpret in their cosmology, and we're going to talk about later how they conceive of homosexuality and heteronormative sex and growth and what is natural, what is physicaire according to them. Okay, so it's not, but pausing also the translation to just point out, like that sex and generation is so central to these rites of the polytheists and consequently of the Gnostics, really shouldn't come as a surprise given how much genitalia have featured in our former assessments of the mystery rites. It's really not that controversial. Maybe the moral judgments of the Orthodox Christians are, but that's a separate matter. Okay, so this promise of the bathing is none other, according to them, than to introduce or bring in to the like unwithering delight or hedonere. That's where we get hedonism from. The one who is washed, according to them, instead of water, rather is like anointed with an ineffable chrism. So pausing there, presumably what's being said there is like because the Gnostics are so like against the material world, their sacraments aren't based on materiality in the way like Orthodox sacraments are, like the water baptism from like a flowing font according to the Didache, the teaching of the apostles, the text so called. It's very much about like, the physical water as a blessing and so on, and redeeming the physical creation. Whereas Gnostics who see matter as accursed are obviously not going to use matter in their initiation rites and their sacraments. Instead, they're going to like have purely noetic mental rites that are kind of divorced from physicality because physicality is corrupt in their cosmology. Okay, so even the bathing that we're speaking of here, the lutron, is of course baptism, right? That term is used in St. Paul's epistle to Titus, Saint Titus, the bishop of Crete, where we get this conception of the lutron tes palingenesias, right? The bathing of the recreation of the palingenesia, the genesis anew, the rebirthing. Because this idea of the new creation, that is inherently Christian language, right? Shared by the Gnostics and the Orthodox. Okay. I mean, unsurprisingly, they're interpreting the same text, right? They're both using people like St. Paul. It's just that the Gnostics, in addition to all these canonical texts of the Orthodox, are using many other scriptures as well, forged from the Orthodox perspective, that draw from the pagan mystery cults and philosophies instead of real apostolic doctrine. And then that informs their bizarre biblical exegesis. Okay. So they say through logos, through discourse, not only through them, but as is witnessed, that the mysteries of the Assyrians and of the Phrygians uh, about the uh, blessed and hidden and revealed nature that is altogether of the things generated in the past, being generated now, and that will be generated, that this nature, which they call the kingdom that is within man, within the kingdom of heaven, rather, that is within the human, is sought out, about which is spoken extensively in the gospel that is forged, that is written in the name according to Thomas, where they say it was told to them, it was given over to them thus. And then a quote, "He who seeketh me shall find, uh, shall find me," I suppose it implies, "in children of the age of 7." Okay, that's the quote from the Gospel according to Thomas. Now, note, pause here for a second. There is indeed a surviving Gospel according to Thomas that contains logia, like sayings or aphorisms slash parabolic teachings ascribed to Christ. Now, it has to be said that text often gets called Gnostic. Now, pause also, there's also a separate thing called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which tells bizarre stories about Christ's childhood. That's not what we're talking about. That's just a totally different matter. That's just infancy gospel literature, right? But the so-called sayings gospel of Thomas that's been found primarily in Coptic, but there are many Greek fragments as well, or several, not necessarily many. But that gospel, honestly, it's not actually unorthodox or controversial. Like, I don't know why some people sometimes call it Gnostic. It does have some odd, like, phraseology and some oddities in it. But the large majority of the sayings, if you actually read the whole of that gospel, as opposed to merely the parts of it that have been separated as being, like, unique and distinct from what is found in the canonical gospels, honestly, a large number of the sayings in there are just the same stuff that you get in the canonical gospels, just said in a slightly different way. And even the novel or unique sayings are really not that controversial or different to what you get in the Orthodox narratives. I'd have no qualms personally with saying, like, the stuff in that Gospel of Thomas that we have today that survived is honestly probably stuff that was genuinely said by Christ, that's would be accepted by Gnostics and Orthodox people alike. It's just very OG material. It's really not that controversial. Some of it is a bit cryptic and a bit edgy, but that's not that surprising because many of the stuff in the Orthodox Gospels is pretty cryptic and edgy too. So yeah, I don't know why people consider that gospel Gnostic. Like, yeah, it can be interpreted Gnostically, but it can also be interpreted in an Orthodox manner. Whereas if you take Nag Hammadi texts, they're exclusively Gnostic. You can't, no matter how hard you try, right, you can't give an Orthodox spin on the Apocryphon of John, right, involving, like, the archons making the separate organs of man, and involving, like, the hypostasis of the archons, wherein Lady Wisdom is, like, subject to pack rape by archons and so on. Like, yeah, good luck trying to, like, incorporate that into the same cosmology as the canonical text. But it goes the other way. It's very easy, though, to take canonical texts and impose a Gnostic spin on them. But what's this quotation from this gospel according to Thomas? So the key point is that the gospel according to Thomas here is not the same one as the one that we have preserved that you can read now that survived in Coptic. Because there were obviously many documents that went by the same name, and many of them have been lost. And so this quotation here is not in that document. Now, maybe it was in that document and the document has survived in a fragmentary way. I mean, is this saying, like, inherently Gnostic anyway? I mean, maybe not. But I think it's probably more likely that it's not in that gospel that we have today, and then it's in another one that bore the same name. Because people don't seem to be open to that possibility that there are many documents that have many names. That's my take on the matter. You can think your own thing, whatever. But what are we to make of this idea that he who seeketh me shall find inside the child who is from 7 years? What's going on here? Well, continuing the translation, St Hippolytus says, "And there, in the eon, like the age that is 14, in this case, it's age like as in the age of a human being, right? It's worth pointing that out. That interestingly, in ancient Greek, the word aion, if you look at, like, its old occurrences in, like, Pindar and Homer, it often means the lifespan of a human being. And how fascinating, right? That eon, like a period of time at the macrocosmic level, is the same word for the period of time for a human. Why? Well, because man is the microcosmic image of the macrocosm, of the divine macrocosm. So there's a relation between our lifespan and the lifespan of the cosmos. That's pretty cool. But anyway, so the lifespan of 14 years therein, the hidden is made manifest. That is, this is to say of that they ascribe to Christ this thing which Hippocrates, the medical teacher, said, namely that a child of 7 years is half of the father. From thence they say that the primordial, the archegonon nature, the physis that was begotten in the beginning, in the arche, this nature of all things, they place in the archegonon sperma, in the semen or the seed that is the beginning of begetting. And they hear this Hippocratic thing, namely that a child of 7 years is half of his father. And in 4 and 10, that is to say 14 years, according to the Gospel of Thomas, or according to the Gospel according to Thomas, this thing is revealed. This logos, this like discourse or teaching that is ineffable or hidden among them, is mystic. And the Egyptians, they say, these Gnostics that compose the Gospel of Thomas and that use it, they say that the Egyptians, who, along with the Phrygians, are the most ancient of all people, they instituted these things, and they then gave altogether mystery initiation rites and orgies of all the gods to other people, in a cohesive manner of confession, like altogether. And thus they, the Phrygians and the Egyptians, were the first to like promulgate and taxonomize forms, ideas, and energies, and to like introduce holy and respected and like ineffable and inexplicable things through the people who were not yet initiated into the mysteries of Isis. So pause there. So what St. Hippolytus is telling us is that these Nicene Gnostics used the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel according to the Egyptians because the Gospel according to the Egyptians was so named because Egyptians in the ancient conception were seen as like the originators of mystic religion, like even implicitly, like even these Orpheus type characters were indebted to Egypt because Egypt was like the OG place of revelation. And according to this tradition, Isis was seen as the first mystery cult from which they all got their content. Keep in mind, like all these Diodorus Siculus characters, and even Herodotus himself, even though he's far less express about it, there is this ancient Greek tradition of identifying Dionysus, who is the central character of the Orphico-Dionysian mysteries, identifying him with Osiris, on account of the fact that both are dismembered, both are reanimated, and remember, both have this missing phallus tradition. That's incredibly important, as you've seen in my other videos treating the mystic rites involving, the severed phallus, and obviously very prominent in the Attis story. But yeah, the text goes on and says, and this is nothing else other than what is snatched and what is sought by the sevenfold robed woman, namely Isis, who that which is to say uh, gen the snatched up by the sevenfolded and black robed lady, namely Isis, which is the Idoion, right, the venerable genitalia of Osiris. So pausing there. So at the center of the Isidian mysteries, right, the mysteries of Isis, is the missing severed genitals of Osiris, because remember he's put together and reanimated by Isis having been like torn apart by his titanic enemy, his brother who committed fratricide, right? Isis, though, in being called sevenfold, the lady of the sevenfold robe, that and the robe that is black, what that means is, as you can see on the right, I find this image amazing. Like I encountered this at an Egyptological exhibition as quite a young fellow, and it made such a huge impression on me to see this coffin casket of the ancient Egyptians, wherein it's quite common in like pharaonic burials. You get this depiction of Nut, who is like lady. She's the equivalent of Greek nux, right? Of Latin nox, of like a lady night, the divine lady who is night, right? And you can see she's got this dark blue slash black body, as the night sky is, dotted with lots and lots of stars and major celestial bodies. And she's spread out. We'll see later depictions of her spread out over Geb, over Earth, because it's the opposite of the Greek conception where you have like Uranus as the male and Gaia as the female. In the Egyptian conception, it's Geb the male, Earth lying down prostrate with his, in his priapic state, with Lady Night stretched out on top. So I guess, it's a bit of a cowgirl situation. That conception informs their like funerary depiction. So you get Lady Night here, star-studded Lady Night, stretched out in the coffin. So the idea is, I guess, that when you're a dead pharaonic male, you get to lie on your back like Earth, like Geb, looking up with Lady Night spread out over you. Which, yeah, I mean, I suppose that's pretty in some ways. So that was a thing, and it's pretty neat. And you can see on the right that depiction of Lady Night stretched out over the world with the sun making its way through like the cosmic waters and going into her mouth and then coming back again out the other end and repeating the cycle, which is, I guess, pretty funny. All right. So back to the text. So yeah, but the point here is that this severed genitalia tradition of the dismembered and reanimated Osiris really connects to Dionysus and Attis and all these other characters, and as such, it's a core dynamic of many polytheist mystery cults in the Mediterranean world. Okay, so they call the Naassenes, but presumably they're getting this exegesis from some prior polytheist group, of which there were no doubt many with many diverse forms of exegesis, right? There's no need to like boil it down to just this. This is just one strand, no doubt amidst many. Okay. But Osiris they call water, and the nature is sevenfold about her, for she's adorned with like seven ethereal robes, and these are the planets and stars that are so called in this allegorical manner. They are called ethereal. And according to them, Genesis, generation that is like changeable, that shifts, is um like brought about by the ineffable and non-depictable and non-conceivable and formless nature that takes on form, as is shown. So pausing there, this is kind of interesting, right? There's this idea, like you see this certainly in Plato's Timaeus, that the heavens and the heavenly bodies are like these purer, more accurate first icons of the noetic, invisible, transcendent realm. Okay. And then lower life forms are modeled thereon. So, like the starry constellations give like blueprints for lower creatures that model those animal constellations above. And so you have this intermediated format whereby you get like transcendent, formless, luminous, noetic realities. They're modeled in the perfect stars, the sevenfold spheres of heaven, right? The seven classical planets, the five planets and the two luminaries that make up seven. And they're associated with the robe of Lady Isis as like the archetypal, beautiful, like female logos character, right? And I just think that image of Nut is in the coffin such a neat depiction of that conception of the female body as the heavens. Okay. Whereas Osiris is water, like you see there in the depiction on the right of like the ocean, which the sun passes through to get back into Nut. Okay. So, but yeah, the idea is that the non-changing, stable, eternal kind of comes down into the world of change through the heavens that kind of intermediates between the ineffable transcendent realm above and the wildly ever-changing realm of generation below is the idea. This is like Platonism 101. This is standard stuff, right? The sublunar world of the corrupt and the hyper-celestial world of the undying, non-changing eternal, right? Very basic stuff that is lost to modern man for the most part, unless he happens to have read a lot of this kind of stuff. Okay. So so this is the thing said, they say, in the scriptures that, quote, 7 times the righteous man falls down and gets up. So he's just pointing out that this quote about you fall 7 times and you get back up in the canonical scriptures is reinterpreted in Gnostic context to have like this astrological significance in reference to like this starry bodied, 7 robed Isis. Okay. And these falls, they say, are the changes of astral bodies um, by the one who moves all things. Now, pause. You might recall if you've seen like my video on the Talmudic passage on Orion, or if you've seen my commentary on Plato's Timaeus, you might recall that in the Timaeus, when the story of Atlantis is told by the Egyptian priest to Solon, and note Egypt alert, right? There, we're told that the Egyptian priest says that the myth about Phaethon, the son of Helios, the sun god, crashing his chariot and bringing about ekpyrosis, the conflagration of the world, the consumption of the cosmos in fire, that tale, the Egyptian priest in the Timaeus of Plato says that tale is to be associated with a parallaxis in among the bodies that move around heaven. Now, what is a parallaxis? A parallaxis is an alteration, a change, a shift. And that's what St. Hippolytus is talking about here in the text. He's saying that this scriptural passage about a moral fall implicitly, is connected to falling celestial bodies. Because as we see in like the Buddhist scripture, the Aganya Sutta, which gives like a creation story, or an anthropogony, a tale of the fall of man, creation and fall of man and other beings. And I think implicit in the Timaeus and implicit in the Orphico-Dionysian mysteries and these sorts of things and Empedocles, there is this conception of like, we were originally stars. We humans were originally starry beings, and we fell from thence. Okay. Now, admittedly, this isn't that different from the Orthodox conception of Adam and Eve, right? Even though, yeah, we're not necessarily stars per se, right? And there is like in Saint Justinian's promulgations against Origin, or more accurately, we should say the heretics who were called Origenists, that went a lot further than Origin himself went. They like were accused of believing that the resurrected bodies of Christians were spherical like the stars. This is rejected by the Orthodox Church, but it's nonetheless true that we are starry in the Orthodox conception when we're resurrected, and if we're of the elect that go into paradise, because the promise made to Abraham, you shall be like the stars of heaven, has, and you get it in Daniel and other passages of the Bible, there is this implication that the righteous shall shine forth like stars, because the luminous resurrected body will be like rather astral. And there's a text called the Apocalypse of Abraham that's preserved in Slavonic. Some people call it Bogomil and this and that and blah blah blah. I don't want to go into that. I don't personally buy that it's Bogomil. I think the Bogomils used it, but I don't think it's like inherently Bogomil. I don't see anything unorthodox in its doctrine. But that amazing text, which I'm a huge fan of, it describes like Eden as a kind of, or it describes Abraham walking with like the Yah angel, like who's essentially like Christ the Logos in Second Temple Judaism. I think that text goes back to Second Temple Judaism. Other people might claim it has Christian accretions. Who can judge such a thing? Who can know? Whatever. But there, Abraham walks with the Yah angel, with this Christ-like Logos figure, and they walk like on the firmament, and God shows Abraham like the story of the world, like the fall of Adam and Eve and so on, as it's drawn out in the stars. So there's this idea of like, the destiny of the cosmos and of each man is like written out in the stars, and it's shown to Abraham. So, and the implication is that like Eden was originally an astral realm, and the garbs of light were rather astral in character, and we've fallen from thence. We've fallen from the kingdom of heaven, right? Even this language in the Lord's Prayer of thy will be done on earth as in heaven, and the kingdom of heaven. Like I feel like modern instantiations of Christianity have lost the basic meaning of like the stars and heaven. Like it literally is the stars, right? Like I think people will say like, oh, what I'm talking about is base and doesn't correctly construct the religion, but I don't think they know what they're talking about. It's a bit more nuanced. It's not just literally the stars in space. There's is a concept of that is a gateway to the transcendent that is noetic and so on. But there is actually strong like astronomical imagery involved in this language, obviously, and this eschatological conception. Anyway, that's a long story, but yeah, I have to say these things because maybe it's obvious to you if you're very learned, but I feel like the majority of like well-adapted normies, on this planet haven't thought about this stuff that much and haven't heard it expounded like that. So hopefully these rants that I interject are helpful. Maybe they're not, and if they're not, I'm truly sorry, but I'm just trying to do my best here, with the limited mental capacity that I've been given. All right, so they say. So that is these Naascenes indebted to the pagan mysteries and the philosophers, says St Hippolytus. They say concerning this sperma, this seed, the essence thereof, that it is the cause of all the things that are generated or begotten. For nothing of these things can give birth, can generate, or can create all the things that are begotten, they say. And they say thus. So yeah, causation cometh from the like transcendent sperma or like logos seed slash semen, um, as opposed to the generated things themselves, according to this sect. And they say, and this is a quote, um, I become that which I wish or that which I want, and I am that which I am. This is assumably a quote from one of these Gnostic scriptures. I become that which I wish, and I am that which I am. And I say, on account of this, that the thing that moveth all things is unmovable. That's like a very Aristotelian conception, right? The unmoved mover and so on. For that which createth remains, that which createth all things remains, and nothing of the things that are begotten is generated. For they say that this thing alone is the good, about which it is said, um, the saying said by the Savior, quote, why do you call me good? For there is but one who is good, the Father, or my Father, who is in the heavens, who causeth to rise from the Anatole, the east, the sun, his son, upon both the righteous and the unrighteous, and who reigns upon the holy ones and the sinners. So that's, a famous quote. I think it's in Matthew, if I recall correctly, if not other places as well, in the canonical Gospels. So yeah, he's just pointing out that this idea of like the cause of all things being like the transcendent logos in the world of generation, he is the cause, not the generated things themselves. I don't know if that's a particularly unorthodox idea, mind you. I'm not entirely sure. It doesn't seem like a wrong idea to me, to my sensibilities. And he's not necessarily always talking about what's wrong, right? He's just he does have a polemic agenda, St. Hippolytus here, but he is also just kind of telling us what these people thought, and not every single element of what they thought is going to be completely deranged. Like there's this weird reductionist argument that like, you have to like disagree with everything. Like no, someone can be like 70% right or 30% right or whatever, right? And these ancient heresiologists were not like that and so inflexible and retarded as to not be able to understand that. At any rate, um, so these certain people who are holy, upon whom it rains, and these sinners upon whom he causeth rain to come. This thing, along with others, we shall speak about it later. For this is the great and hidden of all things, and the unknowable mystery among the Egyptians that was hidden but is now revealed. Osiris, they say, in the temple before Isis's temple. He stood naked and hidden, and below, looking up, and all of his seeds, all of the seeds of um, things generated, he was crowned with them. And he stood not only in the Holy of Holies as the first of the agalmata of the cult statues, they say this thing in the temples, but rather, or also, into for the knowledge of all people, for all people coming to know, it suggests that the light should not be hidden under the modium, the vessel. This is a quote from Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew in the canonical Bible, right, where Christ speaks like says, "Do not hide thy light under a modium, like under a bowl," right? But rather upon it should be set up upon the light stand, like upon the candelabra, the menorah, whatever. Um, this preaching that is preached on the rooftops of houses and in all the streets and all the ways and um, in all the familiar places is that this is a definition and a like a the parameters of the homely familiar that is set up, and this is the good which is spoken of by all people. Okay, so all he's simply saying is that the light of the earth, which in the Orthodox understanding of the Gospels, the light not to be placed under the modium vessel, but rather placed on the candelabra so it can spread out. In the Orthodox understanding, right, that's the gospel that incarnates the Logos, right? It should be spread and saves the world and so on. But what he's saying, St. Hippolytus here, is he's saying that according to these Gnostic Naassenes who use the gospel according to the Egyptians, whereby they actually incorporate real Egyptian polytheist theology into their understanding of the gospel. They identify this light that should not be hidden but should be spread on the rooftops and the streets. You know, the good news that needs to be spread. They identify it instead with this statue of Osiris that's crowned with fruits, like to symbolize presumably its fecundity, that is naked and hidden in like the Holy of Holies of a particular Egyptian temple. Incidentally, there on the right, you see the animating of the deceased and but reassembled Osiris, and you can see how he's priapic, right? His phallus has been reattached in this depiction. And you can also see Shu, the air divinity, spreading apart Geb, the male earth divinity, from Nut, the female celestial divinity, who is the starry sky. And you can see how his hands are positioned right on the important spots. At any rate, so these are further depictions of the priapic animated Osiris, right, that are of some interest given what we're talking about. So they, the Naassene Gnostics, call this good, or this like cosmic principle, the thing that beareth the good, the agathophoron, and they call it this knowing that the Hellenes, right, the Greek polytheists, received from the Egyptians this thing, which they keep to this day. So, pause, what is that thing? Well, that is what I've been speaking about in my other videos. My hypothesis, based on all these writings of Christian heresiologists and apologists who disclosed the mysteries that were guarded closely by the pagans, the believing, polytheists themselves. Namely, that at the center of all these mystery cults and initiation rites is this idea of sparagmos, dismemberment, and the chopping off of genitalia specifically, and then reattaching, and this conception of the division of the sexes, their rejoining, multiplicity and the one, and so on. And it's all centered on the symbols, the cultic symbols, for lack of a better term, of the male phallus and the female, vahaha, right? Okay, so returning to the text. So they say that Hermas, according or among them, was honored in this shape that we shall see. Hermas being just another form of Hermes, right? The famed messenger god. Okay, so they honor him, they say, as the Logios, the Logos one, the um, this Kylenian Hermes. So Hermes of Kylene, of Cyllene, or Kylene, however you want to pronounce that, which is a particular region that Hermes is associated with that's already established like in Homeric poetry, right? So Hermes is the logos, for he is the like interpreter, but he is also the demiurge of begotten things, the things that have been generated, the things that are being generated, and things that will be generated. According to them, he is honored and he stood in this form, being characterized in this shape, namely with the genitalia of a human man that is downwards but has its directional thrust positioned upwards, which is, the patristic way of saying that the statue was tumescent or priapic, or to put it in the vernacular, had a boner, right? So this Hermes is the psychagogue, right? The psychagogos, the one who leads souls, they say. And he is the psychopomp, the psychopompos, right? The one who sends souls forth. And he is also the aitios psychon, the reason or cause of souls. For this does not escape the notice of the poets of the Gentiles of the nations, who say thus, quote, Hermes Kylenius of, Kylene of Cyllene, however you want to say that, uh, he calls the souls from the male suitors, not of Penelope's, they say, O Kakodaimones, O like ones, ill-fated ones, non-divinely illumined ones, not of the suitors, but rather of those who have like awoken from slumber and have recollected through anamnesis, like through special recollection, the truth that they were originally privy to before the fall, from which there is specific honor um, and a great like abundance of wealth. This is the blessed man above, or the arcanthropos, the first man who is the arche, the ultimate cosmic principle, namely Adamus, as it seems to them, who was brought down into plasma, the plasma of clay. That is, plasma being like the thing that is shaped, the creation, the clay creation, the earthen vessel that is the first man. Because remember, Adamus, as the transcendent Godhead, the Logos gets brought down into man. And so they take a quote about Homer, from Homer, right, from Homeric poetry, the Odyssey, about the suitors of Penelope being killed by Odysseus and their souls being taken by Hermes to the underworld, and they reinterpret it through the lens of this cultic statue of Hermes that has an erection that's pointed upwards, and they reinterpret about the soul of man that like is bound down here in the material world, being directed upwards and shooting back up to the sperma, the seed, the sperm, the hypercelestial source of all, that is the hermaphroditic Godhead, the Logos, Adamas. By the way, sorry to backtrack, but I just realized I forgot to mention an important fact about Adamas, the theonym of the Naassene Gnostics, this name of the Godhead. The title Adamas in Greek means like not being conquered, not being like overwhelmed or like suppressed, right? The unconquerable one in Greek. That's where we get like adamantine, because the adamantine metal is the unconquerable metal, the best metal. But it also is a combination of the cardinal points, right? East in Greek is Anatole. Deuces is west. Anatole means there from which the sun rises. Deuces means where it sinks, right? The north is called Arctos, the bear, right? The bear constellation, hence, the North Pole and the polar bear and these sorts of things. And then south, Mesembria, right? But when you combine those together, Anatole, Deuces, Arctos, and Mesembria, you get Adam. So Adam was given this significance of being like spanning the cardinal directions. And also, if you put your arms out like in cruciform manner, you become a compass, right? You become a cross. It's a really important motif to keep in mind, given that we're talking about Christ as the Logos, or as the hermaphroditic Adamus, being who is like cruciform and spans in all directions. There are midrashic portions of the Talmud that identify Adam, who was taken from the Adamah, the earth, as being originally like huge and spanning the entire span of the earth and being identified with the earth, right? And spanning in all cardinal directions. Again, that's the same sort of thing. It's just something to keep in mind. So I should have mentioned that earlier if I forgot. But okay. Uh, so, yep. Returning to the text. So they, so when we like when the celestial, hypercelestial godhead Adamas is like brought down into the creation of clay, they serve, we humans then serve uh, this, the demiurge of this creation, who is called Yaldabaoth, Yaldabaoth, right? This fiery god who is associated with the number four, who's like, yeah, identified with the number four. For they consider this demiurge and father of his own cosmos. That's what they call him. So, yeah, this is the famous fact that the Gnostics, including the Naassenes, identify this material creation as the evil creation of a serpentine, infernal evil being who's called Yalda Baoth. And you can tell by the Baoth ending, it's like um, Sabaoth, or Tsevaot in Hebrew, like the Lord of Hosts. It's got the same ending of hosts. It's unclear what the Yalda part means. There's different theories about what that might mean in Aramaic, but we don't really know. Um, so now Saint Hippolytus is describing the the characteristics of the statue of Hermes, which is given so much significance by these Gnostic heretics, the Naassenes. Okay, so we'll get into the specifics of that.